Good morning. My name is David Ansara, and thank you very much to our audience on our various social media channels for tuning in to this special live stream. And we're very excited to be presenting what we think is a very important and substantive contribution to the policy debate in South Africa. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback there. So as you know, if you haven't been living under a rock, South Africa has undergone a significant political shift. The 29th of May elections triggered a substantial realignment in South Africa's politics. But what we're not seeing in parallel to this is a change in the policy framework. And policy is really where it matters. That's where the tire hits the road. And so, as a policy institute and an advocacy organization that's independent and non-partisan, we at the Free Market Foundation saw this as an opportunity to really elevate the policy discussion and steer the debate towards liberty. And that's why we are launching today the Liberty First program, policy prescriptions, which we feel are going to unlock growth and opportunity in South Africa. Now, many of you last week may have seen that the Free Market Foundation was proud to partner with the Fraser Institute in Canada for the launch of the Economic Freedom of the World report. This is a global report. The Free Market Foundation is one of many partner organizations around the world. And what this index does is it ranks countries, 165 countries to be precise, according to various metrics of economic freedom. And there are 5 categories in this index, 5 key areas. They are the size of government, the legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and regulation. And this takes approximately 45 key indicators, and it is essentially a composite index, and it combines these to produce a freedom score, an economic freedom score, and then it ranks these 165 countries. From the most free, this year it was Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland were in the top 3, United States, New Zealand, other countries were up in the top 10 there as well. And all the way down in the middle at 81st was South Africa. So we're basically the average kid in the class. And so we're neither the worst nor the best, but we at the Free Market Foundation certainly think that it is possible for South Africa to climb back up those rankings. In the mid-2000s, South Africa was in the 40s in those rankings. And so for those of you who are interested, you can check out our live stream from last week. You can also look on our website for more analysis and press statements on that. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be delving a little bit deeper into the methodology behind this index, but also using this as a hook to advance some alternative policy proposals. And this week, we are starting with freedom to trade internationally. What role does South Africa play in the international trade environment? What are our trade policies in terms of tariffs, import restrictions, our ability to move money in and out of the country, how free our capital flows, and so on. And I'm delighted to be joined by our Deputy Head of Policy, Dr. Morné Malan. And Morné has joined us over the last few months, and he comes with a varied academic background, but has a special interest in trade policy and economics. And so he is the perfect person to be authoring this paper that we are releasing today. We'll put a link down to the paper in the description on our YouTube, but we'll also post it on some of our other channels as well. Dr. Morné Malan, welcome to the live stream.
Thank you very much, David. And I think you said it well. We've seen some changes in the political landscape. We've seen some changes in the personalities in the cabinet, but we've not really seen any clear policy direction. And I think the goal of today's presentation, and actually of the whole Liberty First project, is to provide that policy direction so that this parliamentary term can really reap the benefits of what was a fairly seismic political shift in the elections.
Absolutely. And before we jump right in, I'll just say that Morné is going to speak for about 20 minutes. Please do, if you have any questions or comments, please do post those, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. And we'll certainly like to have some healthy interaction at the end. But without further ado, let's hand over to Morné Malan.
Thank you very much, David. And as you said, we want to keep it as brief as possible to allow opportunity for questions. So I'll try my best not to linger too much. Firstly, just a few introductory remarks. Like you said, we are in the post 100-day honeymoon period, and we believe that the first thing, or one of the first things that the GNU has to do, is to introduce a dramatic overhaul of trade policy. Free trade has almost universally been recognized as the engine of growth. Today's advanced economies became advanced economies largely through trade, and a lot of previously small economies are today quite developed economies also due to this. So the goal is to provide recommendations to policymakers in South Africa's post-2024 government, which would enable greater freedom to trade. And given the role of trade, we believe that when we do have greater freedom to trade, will enhance productivity, will boost economic growth, and ultimately will reduce both the breadth as well as the depth of poverty and unemployment in South Africa. And the way that not only trade does that, but freedom in general, is through what we've been calling the freedom dividend. And the freedom dividend is actually a feature of the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which is that it's identified the influence which economic freedom has not only on economies as a whole, but in particular for the poorest of the poor within those economies. So what we can see is that within the poorest 10% in the freest economies, compared to the poorest 10% in the least free economies, the former are roughly 8 times richer than the latter. So, it's not only unquestionably true that economic freedom is good for the overall economy, it's also quantifiably better for the poor within those economies. Now, just as part of the motivation for the project, we're also going to be doing a brief overview of the historical economic data for South Africa, which really motivates a lot of the work that we've been doing, and also sketches a picture of the economy that the GNU has inherited. And another feature of the economy, and here we're looking at GDP per capita adjusted not only for population size, but also for changes in exchange rate. And what you have to notice there, or what we're highlighting here, is not only the fact that we've been stagnating for the past decade at least, but also that hasn't always been the case. The important thing to note here is that we do see recovery in the 1990s from the downturn in the 1980s, and an even steeper growth trajectory in the early 2000s, which unfortunately post-global financial crisis from about 2009 has just completely ceased to, we basically ceased to grow. And that's actually even better illustrated in the next graph. These are growth rates in GDP per capita. And here it's actually quite clear that we're not only not growing as quickly, we're growing ever slower each year. Beyond that little bit of a bounce that we took as a recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see that whereas in the early 2000s, 2% growth in GDP per capita would have been quite bad. In the 2010s onward, that would have been an exceptionally good year of growth. So again, just to note that we've had a very bad decade, but we've also had periods of growth. And what we're going to argue here, and what the data show, is that these differences in growth rates, these differences in economic performance, correlate with the degree of economic freedom, not only within South Africa, not only within specific countries, but also between different countries. So more free economies grow faster than less free economies, but each individual economy grows faster and has more prosperity when it is more free versus when it is less free. Now, unfortunately, those poor growth rates also they also signified, or they also have implications for the real human implications in terms of the unemployment rate. Here again, you can see that whereas we had a slight decline just prior to where this slide begins in the 1990s, early 2000s in unemployment, it's been a steady incline in the unemployment rate since then. Since 2008, there's hardly been a period where unemployment has not, in the overall economy, risen. Grown maybe sounds a bit too positive. But yes, so the unemployment rate continually going up, and you see these periods where just as the economy stagnates, unfortunately the population continues to grow, so we just don't have the economic activity to absorb new entrants into the labor market. And when it comes to new entrants, you're in particularly going to look at the youth, and here's really one of the saddest figures in South Africa is the youth unemployment rate. Again, a massive spike post the global financial crisis in 2008-09, and we never really recovered from that spike. So there's just a structural lack of opportunities for the youth. They just don't have the opportunity to enter into the economy at the moment. So clearly, something has to change in terms of economic policy. We cannot continue things as usual. The final economic indicator is just the impact which policy and which the economic environment has had on long-term investment. This particular graph looks at the change in the year-on-year percentage change in gross fixed capital formation. And the reason why that's important is because this is an indicator of long-term investment. It's an indicator of people investing in fixed projects. So it's not just necessarily foreign direct investment, which can be fairly short-term. This is long-term investment projects in things like plants, factories, mines, residential buildings, non-residential office buildings. But the important thing here is that these are people who have so much confidence in the economy that they're willing to invest for the long term. And what you can see here is that the confidence and the investment in the economy simply has, it's just dried up continually over the past decade in particular. And when you don't have investment, when you don't have economic growth, you can't solve issues such as unemployment. Now, bearing in mind the steady decline in all these figures and the incline in unemployment rates, here's the indication of our overall EFW ranking. And that's an inverted y-axis. So 0 is at the top, or first position is at the top, and the lower, it's actually the higher we rank overall. So we started at roughly the mid-40s in 95, and we sort of kept that in place for about a little bit more than 5 years. But unfortunately, again, and in particular in 2014, we took a steep decline, and bar a little bit of a blip there in the most recent figures, we've actually been in continual decline in terms of the overall ranking on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. So just a reminder there, where we had higher rates of growth and where we had lower rates of unemployment, higher rates of investment, all the good economic outcomes were there at the beginning where we had more economic freedom. And likewise, as economic freedom has declined, we've also seen this decline in economic performance. Now, another important thing, just on that little blip there at the end, is the most important feature of this graph is just to note the long-term trend. We shouldn't be too concerned with short-term fluctuations. We should be far more concerned with the trajectory that we're following at present. Now, hopefully, that's a little bit of a blip. indicates a new path, and hopefully the GNU will bring us back to a path where we are moving up the rankings as opposed to moving down. But that remains to be seen at present. Now, just another indication of where we have of the impact that the rankings have had is a comparison between us and some of our peers in sub-Saharan Africa. Here again, you can see in 2000, we were second only to Mauritius, and today, after having climbed a few, we're still at the bottom of the top 10 within sub-Saharan Africa. So we've been overtaken by a lot of our African neighbors, and unfortunately, this has been largely driven by the imposition of bad policy on our part, and not so much the imposition of, or the promulgation of good policy on the part of our neighbors, although there are certainly countries where that is the case. Now, of course, rankings are always going to be relative, so you can't just look at the rankings, because you can climb rankings when they are, or rather, a climbing of the rankings doesn't necessarily reflect positively upon your policy environment. It could be that other countries have just been declining in terms of good policy at a faster rate. So it's important to also look at scores. And the next slide is going to specifically look at not the rankings, but at the scores, the economic freedom score of 3 different countries. And we're going to track that throughout a period of a few decades, or the same 95 to present period. And the ranking, or the scores here show that when comparing South Africa with the Dominican Republic on the one hand and Romania on the other, South Africa was a 95, the freest of those 3 economies. So we had a score of between 6 and 7, the Dominican Republic even lower than that, between 5 and 6, and Romania, the lowest of all, where they're between 4 and 5. Now, that has changed of late, whereas Romania was the least free. Today, it is the most free of these of the free countries that we're comparing. Likewise, Romania, the Dominican Republic, still in the second place, but now higher. Fortunately, where we were at the very top in terms of freedom, we are today at the very bottom in terms of freedom. And just as another indication of the impact that economic freedom has on economic outcomes, here is the same comparison, but this time in terms of gross domestic product per capita adjusted for exchange rate. And here you can see Romania and South Africa started off in 1995 at roughly the same level in terms of GDP per capita. The Dominican Republic was even lower than that. Having adopted freedom, Romania is today far richer than South Africa. And the Dominican Republic is, whereas it was significantly poorer than South Africa, is today much richer than South Africa. And that holds true even between Romania and the Dominican Republic as well. Romania, having had a larger move in terms of economic freedom, also had a larger shift in terms of GDP per capita. So these are all just indications of why economic freedom is so incredibly important. But to move it now to the topic of today's presentation, the paper that we're going to discuss is going to be focusing specifically on the freedom to trade internationally. And again, here, the outcome looks similar to the overall index. Here we can see that whereas we started in 95 at roughly the 70th position in terms of our international rank, and we improved significantly in the early 2000s, we've been in a steady decline since then, with the latest figure there being roughly 97th in the world. So a consistent trend of less global integration, less cooperation in economic matters relative to our economic peers. This is undeniable. And the impact which it has had on the economy is unfortunately also undeniable. Now, that's the overall score or the overall ranking for international freedom to trade internationally. The following table just indicates what the composite elements are of which that's composed. The four broad categories are tariffs, regulatory trade barriers, so the non-tariff barriers to trade, and black market exchange rates, and finally, the controls of the movement of capital and of people. And what we just have to note here is that when you look through that particular table, you'll see that there's hardly any score that's higher today than it was in 2002. So that's a 5-year rolling period, and I think there's only one particular outcome where we have a higher score today than we had 20 years ago. Now, rather than focusing on that, we've also summarized it into 4 different categories. Some factors we do have consistent good performance. In terms of black market exchange rates, there isn't as big a there isn't as big a delta between the exchange rates of the black market for exports and imports in South Africa. We do quite well on that. The revenue from trade taxes is quite low. So in terms of the mean tariff rate, we do quite well. We don't have very high tariffs as an average over the entire economy. And there's relatively good freedom of foreigners to visit. But unfortunately, there is also a worsening performance. So these are factors which started off quite well, but have been continually declining. Again, non-tariff trade barriers, compliance costs of importing and exporting, and protection of foreign assets, and then, of course, the overall category regulatory trade barriers, so those non-tariff trade barriers. But what we really have to focus on here is the continuously poor performance. And here, the most important elements are the standard deviation of trade rates, tariff rates, our financial openness, capital controls, and controls of the movement of capital and people as an overall score. And this is also what we based our policy recommendations on. So we looked at the index, we analyzed the data, and we compared the data with the index, and we looked where are the areas where we're doing where we seem to be doing particularly poor, and where we seem to be doing consistently poor. Areas where it would be relatively easy for the government to actually introduce a policy which would significantly change the environment. And the first category here is free trade. And the important thing here is just the fact that this is one of the areas of trade policy over which the government has almost direct control. The government can quite easily, without having to go through much of a process, determine what tariff rates are. There aren't really any external factors which influence it. There are certain external factors which do influence trade openness in general, but when it comes to trade policy and tariff policy, government can change these things overnight if they only had or have the political will to do so. Now, the recommendations here are firstly to revoke tariffs and industrial subsidies from the past parliamentary term. The reason why we say only in the past parliamentary term is because there are certain vested interests, and just because an interest is vested doesn't mean it's necessarily illegitimate. But the reason why we focus on the previous parliamentary term is just because they haven't had as long a period of reliance within specific industries. So they haven't been in place that long. So revoking and repealing those tariffs and industrial subsidies will have the least impact. Eventually, we would like to move to as open and as tariff-free trade policy as possible, because all these things tend to distort economic activity. And If you look at the table that we had up earlier, it's whilst we aren't too bad, or whilst we actually perform reasonably well in terms of the mean tariff rate, we do very poorly when it comes to the standard deviation of tariff rates. So we have very skewed tariff rates in South Africa. Certain industries have almost no tariffs in place for imports, whereas others have enormous tariffs in place. And what that does, it just distorts the entire allocation of capital in the economy. And what it also does is it erects a lot of barriers to entry, which is also important for one of the other points here. But yeah, so on the point of tariffs, we also say that the GNU has to implement a moratorium on new or increased tariffs for the current term. So revoke those of the previous term and implement a moratorium on this term. That way we have the policy certainty that there hasn't been a long-term reliance on tariffs in place, and also the certainty that for the next 5 years, there won't be any new tariffs. So companies in South Africa can enter into the market, or they can reliably enter into agreements with international companies to supply and to import various inputs, because that's, of course, the other side of tariff policy is you may be protecting one industry from a competitor, but it's not only to the detriment of the consumers for those products, but also to the detriment of everybody in the downstream of those particular industries. So everybody that uses that product as an input to their own production. So it creates protection not only from international partners, but it also erects barriers, particularly when it comes to policies such as localization, but it also erects barriers within our particular economy. The final point on free trade is then to eliminate the provisions that privilege certain traders over others. These are discriminatory licensing policies, artificial quotas that the government has put in place. All these things artificially hamper the supply within our own economy. It creates a competition between rent seeking instead of having a competition between actual productive economic activity in South Africa. And the reason why this is important is because there are plenty of companies in South Africa which would have tried to serve the international export market, but given the policy environment, given the trade environment, and the immense costs of compliance, they decide to serve the domestic market and to protect themselves from potential internal competitors, as opposed to taking part in the global economy. So we never really reap those benefits of an international specialization of trade, of higher productivity, cheaper goods, and of more global integration. The second part, and this is probably the part where we've performed the poorest, is specifically on financial independence. And here, one of the crucial factors is we have to rid the policy environment of the apartheid era foreign exchange controls, especially when it comes to taking money in and out of the country. The fact is that you can't keep capital. Capital can't be contained. It can only be coaxed. If you're going to try to prevent capital from leaving the country by force, then you're only going to create loopholes. You're going to create inefficiencies. You're going to have people find new and more creative ways, often through less legal means than would otherwise have taken place. Whereas if we open up the opportunity to take capital in, we also invite that capital to take capital out. We also invite that capital to come back in. The fact is, if we want capital to stay in South Africa, we have to create an environment where that capital can grow. Capital doesn't want to be international. I like to travel internationally, but money likes to go wherever it can find the best return on investment. And to do that, we have to provide a good return on investment in South Africa. And what we'll also find is that when we do have a more open economy, not only are we going to attract more investment from the outside, we also open the opportunity for people to repatriate capital. So capital can go find a return in the international, in the global economic environment, and that return can be repatriated and spent in South Africa. The other point on financial independence relates specifically to fund managers and also in particular to fund managers within the pension fund environment. And here we actually call for the removal of any regulations which limit pension fund managers, which limit the decisions of pension fund managers. Pension fund managers do have the best interests of their clients at heart, and they are going to invest wherever they see the best opportunities for growth, taking into account the risk, both the risks and the benefits. But the fact is that people are missing out on opportunities for growth, opportunities for increased growth globally. South Africa is a very small part of the international economy. I think it's around 1% of the global economy. So we are significantly limiting the investment opportunities which pension fund managers could have investment in. And that, of course, over the long term has a significant impact on the growth in pension funds which would have, given that growth, been spent in South Africa itself. So give that capital the opportunity to grow and have it be spent in this country once it's done the growing. We can have the international market grow our capital, and then we can spend it once it's been realized in South Africa. Of course, even better would be to open up the global market and to make South Africa a more attractive opportunity, more attractive investment opportunity for anybody allocating capital. The final point relates to international travel, and it's really the same principle as the principle for goods and services, also relates to the movement of people. Here we have two broad proposals. It's a bit of a two-tiered system, but that's mainly due to political considerations. We believe that having visa-free travel would be the ideal for all countries, but we believe that implementing visa-free travel for, at the very least, all African countries and BRICS countries, our BRICS partners, would already have a significant impact on economic growth and opportunity in South Africa and in the continent in general. And you can see that in the global environment. You can see that the US doesn't place restrictions on which states you can move between. Likewise, when it comes to the EU, the movement of people between countries in the EU, that facilitates greater productivity. It allows skills to move around. It allows people to exchange ideas, to exchange their talents, to present their skills. It benefits both the individuals in question and the countries that now have that human capital in the country themselves. So firstly, visa-free travel for all African and BRICS countries. And then secondly, and here we have actually seen a bit of movement on the part, this is maybe the one point of the paper where we have seen a little bit of a change in terms of policy on the part of the GNU, and that is to reduce the discretion in visa granting by using objective criteria and immigration laws. We welcome, of course, the new policy introduced. We do believe that having removed discretion, that will have a positive impact on the flow of human capital and on tourism. Of course, removing discretion is one thing. We can also just lower the requirements for entrance into South Africa. The fact is that everybody benefits when people come to South Africa to make a better life, or to if they already have a good life, then they can make it even better with our wonderful weather. But when they do that, it's not to our detriment, it's actually to our benefit. So to conclude, international trade and exchange has been an engine of growth, prosperity, and human flourishing throughout the world and throughout history. We believe it will stimulate competition, lower prices, and create opportunities for South Africa's poor and unemployed. We are the main policy to, just to sum it up in 3 points: eliminate restrictive tariffs, reduce unnecessary regulations, and open up the financial markets. And by doing this, we can generate and distribute those dividends of freedom, those freedom dividends that I referred to at the beginning of the presentation. And again, just those figures: your freer economies, the poorest 10% in your freer economies earn on average 250,000 Rand or $14,204 per annum. That's compared to just 30,500 or $1,636 in the poorest. So it's a massive gulf. The difference is stark in terms of the dividends paid by more freedom versus the tax of having less freedom in an economy. And put simply, we believe that liberty has to be put first in trade policy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Morné Malan. And for those of you who are watching, I would urge you to please do like the video and also subscribe to our channel for more updates. We'll be releasing 4 more of these papers over the next 4 weeks. So we're going to be very busy indeed here at the FMF. But I also want to encourage you to pose your questions in the chat. We also would like to encourage members of the media in particular to pose their questions, and we'd happily get to those. But Morné, just whilst we wait for some of our audience to submit their questions, I mean, I think just when we look at the actual scores under this area, tariffs were not doing too badly, 7.45 out of 10. So the higher you are, the more economically free you are on these measures. But the regulatory trade barriers, that's quite low at 5.57. Black market exchange rates, that's a 10 out of 10, so we don't have that problem apparently. But then controls on capital and people, that's 4.81. So it's a bit of an uneven picture. And, just in terms of where you think some of the quick wins would be, I mean, we've sort of spoken about the visa regime. What I like about these policies is that they don't really cost anything to implement, right? It's not like a huge infrastructure spending program. Yes, there might be losses in revenue from tariffs and so on if those are lifted. But where do you think the government should be focusing most of its energy within this key area?
Yes, well, I think that you hit the nail right on the head, David. For the most part, there isn't a significant cost involved, whereas there is a significant benefit associated with the change in policies. When it comes to where would we like them to focus on first, the obvious answer is to have them focus on those areas where it's the easiest to adopt a new policy. So some of the policies would require, some of the policy prescriptions would require new legislation, but for the most part, when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to some of those regulatory barriers, those can be changed by the stroke of a pen, and they can be changed, by the end of the week, if only we had the political will to do so. Of course, there are certain, as I alluded to, certain vested interests, but again, the impact of these sorts of things are that, whilst they might benefit a certain concentrated smaller group, the overall impact is still negative. So, in economics, you have to consider not only the seen, which is the fact that there are certain people benefiting from a policy, but also the unseen, which is the unconcentrated costs that are borne by everybody in the rest of the economy.
I think you're channeling Henry Hazlitt and his economics in one lesson, the seen versus the unseen. But yeah, I think second order effects are so important. I really like the point that you made around how the uneven application of our tariff regime leads to a lot of distortions in terms of capital allocation. And that is one of those unseen costs. All right, so let's show some questions from the audience here. So on YouTube, PropLib asks, do you think the government of national unity has the political will to follow through on some of your proposals? Thanks, PropLib. What do you think, Morné?
So far, it's as though the government of national unity has been a bit unclear about what the policy direction is that they're hoping to follow. We've seen a bit of a halt in bad policy, and we are seeing some signs of an implementation of good policy. What we're hoping to achieve with this is to provide a clear path for a new policy direction. We're trying to chart the course towards prosperity, towards economic growth, and so it's almost as though the GNU's been groping around a little bit, looking to find what should be the policy direction it goes in. What we're hoping is to influence that policy direction. And like I said, it's not really the case that we have necessarily ideologues as a whole in the GNU at the moment. We do have a more pragmatic stance in the GNU, and we do believe that given the more pragmatic sway or the more pragmatic spirit within the GNU, there's actually, it's probably, if there isn't necessarily the political will, there certainly is more will today than there has been for probably the last 3 decades.
But I think last week we saw something very interesting indeed, which I think showcases some of the problems. So I think there is this policy status quo bias. And many of the problems that we have in South Africa, which have led to this political realignment, are ultimately caused by misaligned policy, right? And policy is the expression of the political balance of power in our society. And so Sakelige, the business group which you were once associated, they recently made a press release and inquiry with Minister John Steenhuisen in the Ministry of Agriculture around what they term agri-BEE conditions, which essentially impose race-based criteria on exports and apply export duties unevenly. So that's ultimately a cost that non-compliant exporters are going to have to bear themselves. And, that seems very inconsistent or at odds with, in this instance, the DA's policy paradigm, which tends to favor more non-racial policy proposals. So, and in that sense, there was a disjuncture between the Director General, who represents the civil servants in the department, and the minister. And ultimately, that's going to have to be a political clash that's going to need to happen there. All right, let's see what other questions have come through. All right, also on YouTube, Leanne asks, how would the reduction of import tariffs impact the protection of local manufacturers? I think that's a concern that many people would have. Are we going to be wiping out some of these fragile industries by exposing them to foreign competition? But I think we have an answer for that particular challenge, don't we?
Yes, David. I think that there is this sort of argument, even in the field of economics, there's this argument that whereas protectionist policies in economies can, in certain circumstances, be justified. One of those circumstances is in the case of what they call an infant industry, so an industry that's not quite developed yet, and then you basically protect them from international competition until they grow strong enough to stand on their own 2 legs. Now, I think that in the case of many local industries in South Africa, we've had them in the status of being infant industries for decades. And at some point, you do have to turn to the infant and say, you're 20, 30 years old now, and you have to move out of the basement and you have to start standing on your own two legs. Because the unfortunate thing with these protectionist policies are that they do have a negative impact on the overall economy, but they also create these zombie industries that exist solely based on the largesse of the government. They're not actually efficient. They're not actually productive. They are only being kept in place by the protection currently provided by the government, which means that they're highly dependent upon government, and unfortunately, they're also highly dependent upon the tax money of South Africans, and as we alluded to earlier, those second-order effects on many of the downstream industries and on potential competitors far outweighs any potential benefit to any specific industry.
Yeah, and ultimately, it's consumers who are going to have to shoulder the cost of those additional costs. So I think that that's something that we really must be cognizant of. I mean, we're all keenly watching the elections in the United States at the moment. Donald Trump's argument is, well, he wants to make China pay for everything that it's taken from the United States. But ultimately, what that's going to mean is if he imposes additional tariffs on China, that it's going to be consumers that are going to be paying more for consumer goods and also primary inputs as well in the manufacturing process. So I think we also have to be realistic. South Africa is a small open economy, and it's very important that we are integrated into global supply chains. We can't necessarily expect to produce everything along the value chain, for example, in producing a BMW, but we can significantly contribute in terms of assembly, taking advantage of other trade agreements like AGOA, for example, and there are secondary industries that can build around that. And integrating into global supply chains is perhaps a more effective strategy for us. All right, and I think that those are all the questions that we have. We promised to keep it short, but I just wanted to say thank you very much to everyone who joined us. Please, a final reminder just to hit the like button on this video just to make sure that it gets disseminated far and wide. And I also wanted to say a very special thank you to Dr. Morné Malan. This is a very interesting paper. I'd encourage you to check it out. Link is in the description and also on the Liberty First website. That's libertyfirst.co.za. And do look out for the next papers in the series. And I think very important at this moment in South Africa's history that we really change the policy conversation towards liberty. And that's what has prompted us to launch this project. So thank you very much to our project partners as well for making this project possible. And we look forward to seeing you at the next live stream. That'll be next Tuesday. But until then, stay free.